Hey everyone, it's Andrew. Welcome to Atomo. It is October 13th, 2023, and I'm calling this, let's just set it up. I'm calling this when COVID ended and the military operation seemed like just happened. COVID military operation in Ukraine from Russia. COVID kind of dies in a whimper. That's Act One. Then it seemed that Ukraine started to die in a whimper, and something set us up for Act Two. The kind of geopolitical winds changed, or speaker change within the House. Bond yields are rising. It almost was a setup for something new is going to happen. And then we got the thing with Hamas and Israel in the Middle East very recently. So we're trying to make sense. I know everybody's trying to make sense of it, and hey, everybody's a closet geopolitical analyst now. It is what it is. Let's just roll with it. Um, in this video, what I'm looking to do is just throw some ideas around into the sauce and see what potentially sticks. So this is theory. This is theory craft. Disclaimers on this are offering. There's no ill will from my part to anyone. Loss of civilian life is horrible, regardless of the side that you're on. So, looking at this from a neutral lens, I'm looking at this from if there are players at the game board. And I'm not saying that to diminish what's happening, what's going on, but I have to look at this realistically. There are people playing geopolitical, like a big game of Sid Meier's Civilization on the real world, our Earth, and can't look at that through kind of wishy-washy glasses. Like there's things that are happening, and we have to be willing to talk about this in these times and to look at what might be happening and why are things happening the way they are. Obviously, we never hear about everything. So, the first setup I want to do, let's go to, let's pull this back. I want to look at again at the Mackinder-Hartland theory and just set that up. And here we go. All right. So I talked about this in another video, and I'll just do this in a nutshell. Is the world island here? It says the world island is comprised of the interlinked continents of Africa, Asia, and Europe, Afro-Eurasia. This is which is the largest, most populous, and richest of all possible land combinations. The offshore islands include the British Isles, Japanese archipelago, Malay archipelago, and the outlying islands include the continents of North America, South America, which are the Americas, as well as Oceania. Uh, kind of sets up, it kind of feels like, I think Orwell in 1984 used this to kind of set up the areas. Um, the heartland, the big one is that center of the world. Says here it stretches from the Volga to the Yangtze and from the Himalayas to the Arctic. Kinder Heartland, the area then ruled by the Russian Empire and after that by the Soviet Union, minus the Kamchatka Peninsula region located in the easternmost part of Russia near the Aleutian Islands and the Kuril Islands. So Mackinder in Democratic Ideas in Realty says, who controls East Europe commands the heartland, who rules the heartland commands the world island, and who rules the world island commands the world. So we're still battling for this world island. Now, Ukraine was very important in the sense that if Russia could secure Ukraine, Ukraine has important gas conduits, and energy is a big part of this. So in the previous videos, and what I hold on to is, if you're a player at the geopolitical game board, you need funding and energy. If you got funding and energy, you can then set up productive enterprise. Yes, you do also need other resources as well. Primarily, you need the funding and energy to activate them. If you have those, then the resources kind of that is a secondary piece that we can bring into the equation. So if you have the funding, have the energy, then you can start to collect your assets on the game board, because the way that the world works at the time that I was thinking about this, and it gives us that setup. So let's go back to this thing here. So Europe, if we look at Europe's position and what was happening in Act 1 is, and prior to Act 1 and prior to COVID, we had a I have to take pauses and really think about this. We had a coordinated central bank policy, a zero or negative interest rate regime that was in play from 2008 and up until recently when Jerome Powell started to raise rates. In the zero interest rate environment, money is flowing easy, and that takes care of the capital requirement. Energy was also flowing quite easily. A lot of this green stuff, green energy, wasn't quite at the forefront as it is now, but I think that's on the waning side. And what made Ukraine important in the Mackinder theory, I'll bring this back for you. Here we go. That seems really small. Oh, that helps a bit. I'll make that bigger for you. Europe is outside of that area called the pivot area. And even by the looks of it, that pivot area does encompass Russia. Now, this is old, and my feeling is that this pivot area has changed a bit. This marginal crescent here, I think, is the important part. You're not going to be able to get this area out of Russia and China. That's pretty much locked in. But you do see there's an area where Ukraine is in the Black Sea, and that kind of on that periphery. So NATO, of course, wants to creep in to get into the pivot area, and hence why they do what they do. Russia, of course, doesn't like that encroachment. Would Russia like to expand? Most like I think any country would like to expand. So I don't want to make a thing, oh, Russia's expansionist. Okay, I think any group will want to expand their influence. The more that you can expand your influence, we think of it like a game of Go. If I can have more pieces and more chips on the board, I have a lot more options. And if a big flip happens, I'll still have a large contingent of stuff on the board that is still under my control. So if the coordinated central bank policy, zero interest rates, that helped Europe quite a bit. The one key thing is the US, and then basically primarily the world banking situation, was connected in Britain there through LIBOR. So my theory is energy is important, and Mackinder Heartland plays more to the energy, but there's also the financial conduits. And the city of London basically holding everybody at a stranglehold with the interest rate regime. That was broken when SOFR came into play. SOFR, secured overnight funding rate. that allows the United States to have their own market interest rate. And so US and Canadian banks decoupled off of LIBOR. That means Britain no longer has a connection to control the financial conduits within the USA. And this is very new. This happened, I believe, in June of this year. This is 2023 at the time of this recording. And that gave Powell more impetus to keep raising rates and to keep on the policy of, okay, low, like to reduce the inflation. But it beggars, it's back to old Bernanke saying, we can't beggar thy neighbor, which basically means we're coordinating central bank policy across the world. The one group that was winning on the game board at that time was Europe, which I'll use what other analysts are calling the Davos crowd. Now, that puts the way that Yellen and Bernanke were operating the Federal Reserve seemed to be at the kind of the convenience of Europe. If Lagarde needed anything, or Mario Draghi when he was there, they could get what they needed from the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve would bail them out, and that creates offshore dollars. And the offshore dollars were used to build up things like the World Economic Forum, and other factions grew off of that. And the Democratic Party of the US is another big beneficiary of that as well. The central bank policy doesn't quite help Republicans, who tend to be more from the neocon side or big oil, which gives another dimension to this. Is Europe doesn't have large hydrocarbon storage. So on the resource side, well, they could have money, well, they could have energy was shaky. They were able to get it from Russia with the Nord Stream agreements and transits through Ukraine, of course, of which we know the Biden administration had a lot of deals going on with energy there as well. So they're a faction that gets benefit from energy transit into Europe. So then Europe, for many reasons, which are I still don't quite understand, pivoted away. They don't have a strong hydrocarbon industry. So what they then want is especially the green revolution. If we don't have hydrocarbons, nobody should have hydrocarbons, is kind of the idea. And so they'll thrust green policies around the world. And with the growth of the Davos crowd, who found home within the Democratic Party in the USA, to which the Democrat Party then brings on the Obama administration, and then the Obama administration part 3 through Biden in that group, they can then enact policies that are, so you have to look at the Biden administration as vandals in the USA. Why do I say vandals? It doesn't seem that any of the policies that they're putting forward really benefits the United States of America. That means there's possibly another faction at play that has the administrative arm of the US Republic as an asset to, so they're basically a game piece on the board, to which we'll call the Davos player has control of. So the Davos player has control of Europe. Davos player has control of, USA and the Five Eyes, probably through, if we throw British MI6 into play as kind of a decision center that's operating this, that sets up a bit of that faction. So as long as the central bank policy was near zero, then Europe can spin all kinds of these projects like the World Economic Forum, get the United Nations involved. Bill Gates goes running around doing what he does with his vaccines and kind of transhumanist movements and ways of, and AI, of course, as well, and moving those things forward in a way of gaining soft control or power for their faction, kind of at the detriment of the hydrocarbons faction. Now, the hydrocarbons faction, and I'll go back to here. The hydrocarbon faction, think of the Bush administration, Bush 1, Bush 2, Bush Senior, Bush Junior, and a lot of, the old style, hey, Republicans, you're big business, you're hydrocarbons, and you're doing this all and making all this money on the backs of us little people. Can we get cut in on this? And it seemed that that faction has been fallen by the wayside. Because the other thing we look at is there's a strategic petroleum reserve, and it just seems that, okay, Biden has been draining that for some reason. And strategic petroleum reserve it's not, the idea of it is not there for the enjoyment of making money off it, though they can. There's no real, from what I've read, there's no statutory limits on what it's for, but primarily is you have a strategic petroleum reserve, because if you need to fight a war somewhere, and if the US wants to project power, that could come at the detriment of a cut supply chain for somebody that wants to cut the USA off of their oil reserves. Now, the US has been, they do have a lot of hydrocarbons, but it comes at an expense to ramp up, and they've been ramping it down. That's part of the green energy thing, is weakening the USA and the hydrocarbon industry within the USA, and that limits the ability of the USA to project power. So that allows the oil factions, it diminishes their power because you're reducing the amount of energy they have at play through policies. And it's not that that faction wouldn't want to deploy their energy. It's a fact that you have a faction in control of policy generation that diminishes the power of the other faction. Okay. Now it seems I'm being long-winded here, and to get to the point, even I'm looking at here 18 minutes into the video, and I haven't even talked about Israel yet. There's a lot of setup here. So this one's going to be longer for those that want to get through here. All right. So other faction in play is the New York Bank Club. They don't want to see, because part of what the Davos faction will gain if they gain control is the one world government. Well, what could Europe do if you don't have hydrocarbons? Well, we could be the administrative center of the world. In order to do that, then you need to gain access, again, energy and financial streams. Well, if they kind of got the energy coming in through Russia, though that got disrupted later. If I talk more about the New York club, they don't want to see Jamie Dimon. Do you expect Jamie Dimon is going to give away his bank to a bunch of Euro trash technocrats? Jamie Dimon, probably the most powerful person in the world, like aside from whoever controls an energy stake. He controls a financial stake, and if he were to get together whoever controls the energy stake, then that faction could inevitably win a big piece of the world island. So go back to, because I'm sitting here staring at it still, is if Russia, so let me finish off. So the New York faction and the New York boys, in order for them to continue, first they need Jerome Powell, which Jerome Powell is doing a little bit of if we play it from the side of Jerome Powell's trying to take care of U.S. interests. Now that we're broken from LIBOR and under SOFR, then there's a financial conduit within the USA that other factions within the world can tap into. So if I want to own the world island, I'm going to need some financial power in order to build my infrastructure and to collect these lands under my faction rule. So Europe basically has been capitulated, possibly by the New York boys, through the blow up of Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, which are possibly conduits that Yellen was keeping alive in order to move money into the Democrat National Committee and also over to Davos. Those lines of monetary fuel have been severed, which leaves that faction kind of hobbled. And of course, with high interest rates, a lot of what the WEF and Klaus Schwab needed was the low interest rates in order to keep his policies in work operating. So there's articles that went through that he had to step back some of his work within Europe. Well, what does Klaus Schwab do? Well, he funds NGOs that help change governmental structure within companies. And everybody, if you're watching this, probably know the video where he talks about Canada and how he's penetrated the cabinets. Well, that's what he does. And if you can control policy, then perhaps you can control how energy and finances flow. You can start to create walls and bottle that up. You have to think of finance and energy as kind of like a liquid that sloshes around the world. And Jerome Powell is trying to suck up all of that dollar, like euro dollar liquidity. And a euro dollar means dollars that are outside of the USA. So Jerome Powell wants to suck that up because if he sucks that up, that capitulates the Davos crowd and weakens them. And then it makes the USA just look a little bit better, and that can attract other streams of funding. And potentially the other kind of nail that came through is, and this is where we don't I don't know, Nord Stream and the bombing of Nord Stream. That was potentially to keep Germany from saying, okay, we give up. We're going to go back under a hydrocarbon economy. So it's possible that was done. So German had no way to go back and turn that on. And well, what factions does that benefit? Well, what happens is German industries and other industries within Europe uh, don't have the competitive advantage of extremely cheap energy. Now, Putin has always been looking at how to integrate more with Europe because he has an affinity towards Europeans. He speaks perfect German. Why would a leader speak other languages? He was always extending his hand. And I'm not being a Putin shill and apologist here. The idea is let's look at the players and what they're trying to achieve. And well, if Russia had and Germany were to have a strong handshake, which looked like they did, but then with Angela Merkel, she did that deal and then crafted the Minsk agreements to buy time for the potential removal of Russia influence from the Ukraine zone and potentially to keep pushing back against Russia to keep energy transit corridors open for other ways of getting in energy. And what else could they do? Well, that starts to bring the Middle East into the equation now. Okay. If Davos were to control, and you have to look at this area out here, you can see where the little blip that is Crimea, that if they were to control Crimea, there are a lot of hydrocarbons in that area. So if Davos were to remove any Russian influence from the area, and that's why the Azov battalion was activated and trained and used prior to around 2014 when the Maidan revolution occurred, was to help establish more of the Davos control within the region. And it blows my mind. You're using kind of a neo-Nazi group in order to do that, which sets up a trial balloon. Put a pin in talking about what happened in Canada. Canada sets up a lot of firsts here. It's look at what happens in Canada, because that tells you it's like the pebble that drops in the sea before something happens. What happened before Russia went into Ukraine, the trucker protest within Canada. What happened before the Hamas attack to Israel? Canada celebrates an actual real Nazi within their parliament. Is that coincidence? Well, that's a question that we have to ask. Was the trucker protest? Trucker protest was just something. It's just how the reaction to it came. Tells us it basically, I'm going to digress into this. This is important, I believe. Is that tells other leaders within the world how weak our leadership is in the West. So if you look and say, oh, those truckers, they deserved it. They deserve to get curb stomped with a bunch of kind of police that are doing basically stormtrooper tactics in knocking out these protesters in a way that we haven't seen. I don't think I've seen that in the Western world, that way that it looked like something out of late 1930s Germany. It's just very chilling to watch those videos. And if your leadership does that, they are weak. They didn't even talk to these people. That means if your leadership's that weak, then a more powerful player at the game board can take advantage of that, because they know that, you know what, your leadership can only hit on the small pieces on the game board. They're not going to be able to take on a big piece like Russia or China. It basically tells you that that leadership is just cowards. That Justin Trudeau specifically. Then Canadian government. So that sets up Act 1. It's like, okay, well, if your leadership's that weak, and we see that, in the US, that leader can't even walk up plane stairs without falling on his face. So, here's where, when you look at this as a game, then you put your puppet leadership pieces into play, but they don't work very autonomously. You have to keep control on those puppet leaders. And that's a problem, because when it really comes to conflict and needing to respond in crisis situations, these leaders don't work well within crisis situations. That sets up with a bit of what's happening in Israel. So, and I'm not speaking ill about anybody. I'm just setting up. Well, you got leaders that are very, very, very reactionary. And if leaders have a very strong reaction to things that happen, they can be controlled. And the other players at the table know this. Okay. So that brings us now to the USA. And we get up to the point of Speaker McCarthy was brought into play, though there was a group of holdouts that didn't want him brought into play. And eventually it happened. Said, okay, brought him into play, and there was conditions put onto that. Now, I want to introduce, there's potentially a new faction that's forming here that's always been on the board, but I think they're coming a little more out of the woodwork. I would suspect, this is a suspicion, that the military industrial complex, usually the commander in chief is the president of the United States, but I have a suspicion that there is a crisis of confidence there. My theory is that the US, let's trying to figure out a name for the faction. I'll call them MIC, but it's not really the military industrial complex. It's almost like the Pentagon has been playing a very cool cucumber game all during the Ukraine conflict. We didn't see any drumming of war drums, there's been some neocon chatter on it from the usual suspects like the Clinton era groups, Victoria Nuland, Hillary Clinton. I think she had a little proof of life tour. She went out rah, rah, rah and stuff. But it hasn't been strongly overt. Like, the Pentagon has been really silent about the Ukraine conflict. I think they know, like they know how to play the game, and possibly the decision centers there. My theory, the big theory, is the decision centers at Langley and then the Pentagon are potentially now at odds with the MI6 faction within the UK and GCHQ. This is just some I'm just talking theory craft here. With LIBOR being out of the picture, now the US they don't have a leash around their neck. It takes a lot of money to operate the military industrial complex, and they need customers as well. So you have to look at Ukraine as potentially, well, it's a place where they were just testing weapons and most likely phoning up the Russian group saying, yeah, here's the type of weapons that we're sending over. We're doing our thing to make it look like we're, appeasing our factions, but really we're not doing anything that's going to be very detrimental to the Russians. And then the Russians like, okay, well, we're not going to put our regular people in. We're going to put mercenaries into play because they're expendable. And it's possible, again, more theory craft that what Prigozhin did. Perhaps if you realize that, okay, I'm being played here. We're like Russia's not sending in their regulars and not backing us up, and we're kind of getting wiped out here. The Wagner Group would lose people and people that pass away depending on the contract because mercenaries operate under contracts. Most likely, don't need to pay them as much as if they were to uh, be alive. I'm just not trying to diminish human life here. Just trying to look at it's a game that these people are playing on this game board. And of course, money, you don't want to be spending oodles and oodles of money. You have to maintain the treasury. And Russia has been playing very conservative with their treasury funds. They could do a lot more, and they have shifted to a wartime economy. They haven't been deploying the heavy assets. And the US hasn't been deploying heavy assets because they know this is really not the place that we want to play. And possibly the players at the table who are operating it, Russia is a historical ally of the United States. Russia helped the USA come to independence. Britain still has a burr up their butt, especially if we think about the MI6, GCHQ, and the decision centers within Britain. You probably remember that, hey, Russia helped us back in the day, even though there's groups within, sorry, not the the MI6, like Russia didn't help us because they took our colony away from us and helped that. But unfortunately, maybe unfortunately, if I'm thinking as a player sitting at GCHQ, is like, how do I now get the heartland away from Russia? I need to get parts of that game board under my control. If I'm a British player, that brings another element to this is possibly Queen Elizabeth was a little more forgiving and understanding that because she participated in the Second World War. She was a mechanic, truck driver, and understood that Russia, even though it was the Soviet Union and there was a Cold War, essentially they're still allies. And if you play your cards gently, then they'll play their cards gently. And even Medvedev said, I think in a tweet somewhere, saying, kind of alluding to, well, we're not really, I think I'm paraphrasing this and just speaking from memory, we're not really against the United States, but he has something for Medvedev has something for the decision centers within the UK, and he said that. Um, so you can see that those two players at the game board look at the Russians as their own faction, because there's a lot of their industries and that are nationalized, so they play as one big uniparty faction within their country, and Putin's consolidated those that all the little factions within Russia, and the Ukraine war gave him a place to actually remove some of the oligarchical control. you know, Collective West just handed him that on a silver platter by sanctioning a lot of the oligarchs' assets. Like, I think in a roundabout way, he said, "Okay, you're just taking care of a problem for me," and that helps him to consolidate control. Um, okay, so the MI6 and the Pentagon crew. Now, the Pentagon crew, the problem that the Pentagon crew faces is they need money in order to operate, and they also need energy. They don't have those. They don't have assets in play. Now, possibly that was some of the work that they're doing in Afghanistan and in areas of Syria and Kurdistan is one. Okay, we're gonna set up kind of an extractive area within a part of the Middle East to give us oil so that we can at least get assets that are off of the balance sheets. Again, if we're playing this as a game and I'm only afforded as the military industrial okay, I'll call it Pentagon player. If I'm the Pentagon player, I don't I only get so much money from the government of the United States, who is under a faction that possibly it doesn't have my long-term best interests at heart, and that's being the Biden and Davos faction. But they'll use me as the Pentagon player and move me around as needed. But I do that at the mercy of them feeding me money and energy as they move me around. So the more that they move me around, the more that I get stuff that I need in terms of funding. But of course, you can't move me against Russia because I'll lose my faction. So of course, I'm not going to go straight in against Russia and risk being nuked off the board. Like, I have to look at that as the real thing. The Pentagon faction has the strongest army on this game board, but it costs a lot of resources to use that asset. So if I'm the Pentagon player, what do I want to do in order to keep my pieces on the board? Well, I need assets. If we're deglobalizing now and we're getting into a point that when debt starts to roll over in the United States because of the high interest rates, my funding is it's a strong risk of it being cut. It's a big line item on the budget. And if I'm not too worried about the political parties completely defunding me, because I, as a player, I got ways of influencing those factions, but it's possible that that influence is waning because I have a lot more influence traditionally through the Republican Party than the Democrat Party. Because the neocon collective tends to group more with the Republicans than with the Democrat Party, though Hillary Clinton was supposed to get in, but I don't think she had enough clout with the neocon class for them to really pull ranks and put their chips behind her. They put their chips behind Trump. Trump didn't activate any new wars, but I also think he didn't disrupt anything on the Pentagon faction game board. Things still happened in Syria. So if I have Afghanistan and potentially opioids and things coming out of Afghanistan, which I could potentially sell and make off balance sheet transactions to help fund my operations, as well as run things within Syria to help fund that operations. Now, all of a sudden, this Biden administration comes in and maybe is not happy with how I'm playing my faction. So he's like, okay, what I'm going to do, think of the Biden, the Davos player is, well, okay, well, you're not doing what we want you to do. You're not participating in the conflicts that we want to have operating. Davos is aligned with the British player. The British player does not like Russia at all, and they want to put me as the Pentagon player in direct contact with the military forces of the Russian player. That's a no-win situation because Russia knows that they can't win against if the whole US army mobilizes and goes for Russia. Russia is not going to stand a chance because then they'll get NATO behind them, and then it's basically it's nuclear at that point. And that's game over. That's a no-win situation. Okay. So if I haven't been playing to the wills of the Davos player as a Pentagon player, well, they're going to take away my honeypots, take away my Afghanistan honeypot, have that go away, take away my um, little Middle East honeypot. So Afghanistan was one. That's my financial conduit because I can sell that product. Poppy. There's a lot of poppy in Afghanistan. I can use that to gain some financial resources that I need. And then I have my energy resources through some operations that I'm running in Syria. So that helps keep kind of like a dial tone for my faction up and running. And these are dark pieces on the board that mainstream media and all that don't say anything about. You'll get some, you can piece through it, but it doesn't get talked about very overtly. So now those have been taken off. So now I'm facing more of a slowly an existential crisis here. I can't attract the talent that I need. I'm a bit of a bureaucratic mess, but that's my problem that I need to sort out. Um, so what do I do? Well, if I can get into an alliance with some energy producers, now I'm looking back at this inner or marginal crescent. If you look across the inner or marginal crescent, I have some options there. I have the option in Southeast Asia to exert some influence there, but the payoff on that is very low. There is energy in the region, but I don't think I can really make any groundbreaking moves there. There's the Indian subcontinent. Again, nothing really groundbreaking there until I get over to the Middle East, where I got an immense amount of energy and potentially like I got the financial. I'm going to get the New York White Shoe Boy in my club, and I'm potentially going to work with some of the groups that are already in play there. Now, what I would do is I would look at gaining some sort of control of the oil assets in that region. What I would really like to do would be to flip Iran and get them into get their commanding heights. So what I mean by that is there are commanding heights are the controlling industries of my territory. Communications, energy, resources, water, resources, commodities. And if I can work out a deal that gets me access to Saudi Arabia or Iran, maybe even a bit of Qatar, then that puts me in a state to give me the energy backing. But I'm going to need to pay my backers for that privilege of flipping those. So that means I have to, I can't use overt force to do it. And I'm starting to think out loud here. But I could start to get shares of these. So there has been some work, I think, with the Biden regime through the Atlantic Council to start moving into the country, especially in the Middle East, and start building energy deals in there. And that's potentially why we've seen a lot of the kind of Biden news pop up, especially with Hunter Biden, because there's a group that's running interference on that. Perhaps Davos sees the play that's on the board, and so they're playing to expose a bit of what's happening. But then the military, the Pentagon player, what I would do is say, okay, well, if I get rid of the weak Biden player and kind of like pull them off the game board and take their chips that they were starting to build out, then I have the potential of suspending Belt and Road Initiative work that's going on between, again, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and insert myself and become a barrier so that now China and Russia is building the north-south transport corridor. So they're moving from St. Petersburg down to an area, and it kind of moves along the line here of this western part of the pivotal area. So if we can create like this big cross, if China can do a Belt and Road that goes all the way into Africa and connects them, and then Russia does the north-south one, then basically they can build a conveyor belt for resources and commodities going both ways and connect the world island together and have full control of that. So then another thing that I need to do is I need to get, Suez Canal and Strait of Hormuz down here, get those under my control. In order to do that, I then have to, I think this is where Trump was coming in with the Abraham Accords, is opening up ways for me to do it. So I'm thinking that I got, possibly as the Pentagon player, I got Trump under my wing. So I can send manila envelopes over to Trump and say, this is what I need done. He's a business guy. And in order for me to build my assets, I need a business guy in my field, in my court. The problem that I'm going to run into is if I start unifying the Arab world in order to create enough stability for me to start to purchase their assets and their industry and their commanding heights, Israel's not going to want this, because that turns into an actual existential threat to Israel. And we saw the Biden administration slowly starting to kind of pull away from Saudi Arabia, and it looked like they were going to kind of start damaging those relations. And so I'm thinking from the Pentagon player standpoint who wants to stay on the board, I don't need, it's going a little too far. So in order for me to execute my strategy, I need a more pacified Israel in play. In order to do that, I have to change the leadership of Israel. That's potentially what might be happening here. I'm wondering, why is Trump now saying things about Netanyahu that are not in favorable light? So is Trump jump the shark here? Well, the theory that I'm putting forward is, well, no, it's possibly need things to change a little bit within that area of the Middle East. So, what are some of the, and again, this is no ill will towards Israel, Palestine. I'm just trying to think things out and to see what happens. That's why I thought in the Canadian Parliament, the bringing forward of the Nazi and testing to see, well, how does this work? Was there an enormous backlash against that? In some senses, yes, but I don't think it came from. I don't think the signal that was being told was there's not as much. Hmm, if that were to happen 20 years ago, there would have been an uproar, but it wasn't as much as I thought would happen. I didn't like it at all. Um, but I might be a relic of an older time. And the newer generations are like, whatever. That means potentially the Israel, and Israel is a project of Great Britain. Great Britain, with the Palestinian Mandate back after World War II, created the state of Israel. And so it's primarily their project, and the US being a little more independent now because LIBOR has changed to SOFR, which is under US control, now potentially has more autonomy to say, we need to shift things a little bit within the Middle East so that we have access to those hydrocarbons. Better to use up somebody else's hydrocarbons than my own actual storage that I have underneath my land, which I might need in the future. So I have to predict, what iteration of the game do I want to be playing in the future? And if Saudi Arabia and in the Middle East are all drained of their hydrocarbons, then I still have my inventory in the United States and Canada, which potentially is why Canada isn't developing as strongly as they could be. Um, and there is also change on Canadian coal as well coming up, but that's outside of this. So it's possible that Trump has been given some manila envelopes across his desk saying, here are things that we want to do. And then there was a setup where potentially Israel was going to go in and just start bulldozing through Gaza. Now, there was a trial, looked like a trial signal that was sent out today that they were asking when the big hospital within Gaza evacuate. We're coming in. And it's like they're gonna bomb the hospital. Like there's a line too far. And I think there is an overplay and overreaction there. And this is now data for the players at the table say, oh, I had a very overt overreaction. Because notice how Putin doesn't overreact against provocations. Like he plays the game very well. The Israel high command and seat of government does tend to overreact. I think this is possibly one of Netanyahu's, this is one of his weaknesses is, yes, he cares strongly about Israel. I don't doubt that. But also, it gets dialed to such a high level that now that there are so many cameras on these, everybody has a little camera in their pocket, everybody has cell phones, everybody's sending this information out. Elon Musk has made Twitter open, so we're going to see this. We're going to have, if something happens, we're going to have a front and center view to this, almost like, think about the movie Running Man back in a long time ago, where, oh, you were a baddie, then you got put on this game show and you went against these characters in the game show, and basically you're there to survive. You're going to get cut down and chopped up, even though they say some people survive the game show, and then once you do that, you're basically pardoned from whatever crime that you have, and you go on like Whitman, Price, and Haddad. Here they are basking under the Maui sun. They found that they were didn't really happen. You have to watch the movie in order to understand the reference. But that's essentially the metaphorically what I'm putting up to you here is that if any of these players overreact their positions, the court of public opinion is going to pick up on it. And what Israel does not need right now is the court of public opinion against them. Already, we see that there are pro-Palestinian protests, or friends of Palestine, or whatever you want to call them, that are activatable assets now on the game board. And this is where we have to see how that plays out. Because there wasn't a strong push down or condemnation of them. And you saw on the videos that they were in a lot of city centers around the world where they were managed. But now it's like they're there. And so it could be showing that kind of the Israel card that can be played is not as strong a card as like the baby boomers. If you played the Israel card, they'd be like, "Oh no, 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 guys, okay, stop, stop, stop. Sorry," and couldn't do that. But now we're seeing that there's a different element in play, and this is where I'm thinking that I think maybe I'm getting long in the tooth here on this video. Is potentially there's a military industrial complex play that we need Israel to not be as reactive to how the game board is now going to be reset within the Middle East. And there's going to be a lot of work to reset the game board in the Middle East. So at least there's a block on how that energy is going to move within that region. And if you think about ants will go out and they'll find a resource, and they have to collect that resource as fast as possible before the other ant colony comes in and collects that resource. Because once the resource is consumed, it's gone. So the lands of outer or insular crescent need a stake on the world island. And so I believe, and because the Mackinder-Hartland theory is still, believe, a thing within, that's why I'm putting my Pentagon player hat on. It's still a thing on my part of the game board. And it's a doctrine that's actively used. So they really need to think how they're getting a piece of the energy rich Middle East. Because if they lose all of that, then they're playing on their back feet. And basically, the Russia, potentially China faction allies with the Middle East, they brought additional countries into BRICS to help build out the Belt and Road Initiative very recently at their last meeting. And the previous, the NATO meeting that happened a few months ago didn't result in any big military action. So I think, again, to close here, that the game board is being set up. The Pentagon faction is going to step a bit more out of the shadows and from behind the curtain, saying, we're playing the game a bit differently now. And it's possible that it could set up the US presidential election in 2024 to get a champion of their position in play. And that could potentially be Donald Trump. Again, I'm not shilling for Donald Trump here. I'm just looking at who might it be, because that will keep the populace, at least half of the populace, okay. Because the other thing I would think from the Pentagon player is I might have to put a junta into place. And so now, as I say that, I think about, okay, well, what are the potential personalities or respected generals, or who do I have within my political retinue that I could activate and put into play? And Trump would be an easy one because immediately I gain a huge supporting base. The Democrat Party, as I've said in other videos, is under looks like a civil war right now because money has been disrupted in them, so they're having sub-faction fighting. Yes, there's sub-faction fighting within the Republican arm, but as the Pentagon player, I can slide a few envelopes across desks and say, here's the way that we're playing the game. And if you play with me, if we flip the big go piece that's the Middle East into our zone of control, then I'm going to make sure that you're cut in on the energy deals. And once I got success with the energy deals, and I can gain some benefit, some knock-on benefits within the bond markets because of that, and strengthen the United States position on the board, then if you played with me, you will be justly rewarded. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. That's just a big theory. Again, this is theory. This is fiction. I'm not getting any manila envelopes myself. I'm just looking at the game board that you see up here on the screen and saying, this is a possibility. And happy if you drop stuff in the comments and say, nope, doesn't work because of this, that, or other stuff. I'll be happy to take a look at that and consider that. But I just wanted to put that out there. So thank you for your time and attention, and I'll see you in the next video.